The word untamable cut through the ceremonial hall like a blade, and Serena felt every pair of eyes burning into her soul as the leader of the immortals reached for her trembling hand. The ancient amulet against her chest grew warm, then hot, until a discreet glow pulsed through the metal and a deep, resonant sound made the torch flames dance wildly. The great hall fell into absolute silence. The bond did not seal. Instead, a collective shiver ran through the gathered witnesses, as if forgotten promises had awakened from their slumber. No one realized in that moment that this subtle sign would challenge centuries-old traditions, fragile alliances, and the very heart of the young woman standing before them all. Serena's fingers trembled as she pulled her hand away from Darius, the leader whose dark eyes held storms she couldn't read. The rejection felt like swallowing glass, but the alternative felt like drowning. Around them, the assembled crowd of immortals and mortals alike began to murmur, their voices weaving together into a tapestry of confusion and anticipation. The ornate ceremonial chamber, with its towering stone columns carved with ancient symbols, seemed to lean closer, as if the very walls were hungry for what would happen next. "The amulet responds," whispered Elder Matthias from the council's high seats, his weathered face creased with worry. "It has been 3 centuries since we witnessed such a reaction." Darius remained perfectly still, his hand still extended where hers had been moments before. The torchlight caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had led for decades, but underneath it, Serena caught something else, something that sounded almost like relief. "The ceremony will be postponed," he announced, his gaze never leaving Serena's face, "until the next new moon." A collective gasp rose from the witnesses. Postponements were unheard of. Once called before the council for bonding, the ritual proceeded without delay. Ancient laws demanded it. But as murmurs grew to protests, Darius raised his hand, and silence fell like a curtain. "The amulet has spoken," he said simply. "We honor what it reveals." Serena wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee through the great oak doors and disappear into the night, but her feet remained rooted to the cold stone floor, and her eyes remained locked with Darius's. There was something in his expression she hadn't expected, not anger at her rejection, not wounded pride, but something deeper, something that looked like understanding. The crowd began to disperse, voices rising in animated discussion as they filtered out into the night. But several figures remained, circling Serena like wolves, sensing wounded prey. She recognized them all, allies and enemies she hadn't even known she'd made. Marina, the village healer, approached first, her long gray robes rustling against the stone. Her kind eyes, lined with years of tending to both mortal and immortal ailments, held genuine concern. "Child," she said softly, placing a weathered hand on Serena's shoulder, "you must come with me. There are things you need to understand about what just happened here." Before Serena could respond, a tall, thin man with scholarly robes stepped forward. Cassius, the council's most dedicated researcher, clutched a leather-bound tome against his chest like a shield. "With respect, Marina, the young woman belongs with the archives tonight. The amulet's reaction suggests lineage connections that must be documented immediately. The old blood books." "The old blood books were lost decades ago, Cassius," interrupted a smooth, melodious voice. Lady Evangeline glided toward them, her silk gown the color of midnight catching the torchlight. She was beautiful in the way that made mortals forget to breathe, and immortals remember why they'd chosen eternal life. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were calculating. "Perhaps we shouldn't burden dear Serena with dusty old theories tonight. She's been through quite enough." "Has she?" The new voice belonged to someone Serena hadn't expected to see. Adrian stepped from the shadows near the door, his musician's clothes marking him as clearly mortal among the supernatural gathering. They'd grown up together in the village before the calling had separated their paths. His brown hair caught the firelight as he moved closer, and Serena caught the faint scent of the tavern where he now played, wood smoke and ale and something indefinably warm. Maybe what she's been through is finally standing up for herself. The tension between the four figures was palpable. Marina's maternal protectiveness, Cassius's scholarly obsession, Evangeline's political maneuvering, and Adrian's fierce loyalty created a web of competing motivations that left Serena feeling like a prize to be won rather than a person to be consulted. "I can speak for myself," Serena said, her voice stronger than she felt. The amulet against her chest pulsed once, as if approving. "And right now I need air." She pushed past them all and stepped out into the night. The village beyond the ceremonial hall was alive with soft golden light from the evening lantern market. Unlike other communities that conducted business in daylight, their settlement had adapted to accommodate their immortal neighbors, who weakened under direct sunlight. The result was a place that came alive after dark, filled with the soft glow of oil lamps and the gentle murmur of nighttime commerce. The familiar sights should have comforted her, but tonight they only emphasized how much her life had changed in a single moment. The market stalls, selling herbs and handcrafted goods, the central plaza where young couples courted under the watchful eyes of their elders, the fountain where children made wishes on fallen stars. It all felt like a life she was watching through glass. Serena. Darius's voice behind her was quiet, almost tentative. She hadn't heard him follow. She turned, wrapping her arms around herself against the cool night air. "Did you come to demand an explanation, or to tell me that rejecting you was an act of treason?" "Neither." He moved closer but kept careful distance between them. "I came to tell you that what happened in there, the amulet's response, the way you stood your ground, it was remarkable." "Remarkable?" She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I humiliated you in front of the entire council. I've probably violated half a dozen sacred laws. I've made enemies I didn't even know existed. You've also awakened something that's been sleeping for 3 centuries, Darius said. "That amulet belonged to the stellar line, Serena, the lost bloodline of the first immortal rulers. If it responds to you, then what?" she challenged. "Then I'm suddenly worthy of your attention. Then I'm valuable enough to bond with the great Darius." His jaw tightened. "You misunderstand. I didn't call you forward tonight because of politics or bloodlines. I called you because—" He stopped, running a hand through his dark hair. "Because from the moment I first saw you defending that sick child in the marketplace, refusing to let the merchants overcharge for medicine she needed, I knew you were unlike anyone I'd ever met." Serena stared at him. She remembered that day, little Clara burning with fever while her parents counted and recounted their meager coins. Serena had stepped in without thinking, offering to trade her own week's rations for the medicine. She'd thought no one important had noticed. "You were watching me," she said. "I was drawn to you," he corrected. "The way metal is drawn to a magnet, the way rivers flow toward the sea, not by choice, but by something deeper than choice." The words hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Because beneath her anger and fear, she felt it too, that inexplicable pull that made her aware of exactly where he stood in any room, that made her dreams restless and her waking hours filled with thoughts she didn't want to examine. "But I rejected you," she whispered. "You protected yourself," he said, "from a bond you weren't ready for, in front of people who don't understand what true consent means." "I respect that, Serena. More than you know." Before she could respond, Marina appeared at her elbow. "Child, we must speak privately. The night grows cold, and there are things about your heritage that cannot wait until morning." Darius stepped back, the formal mask sliding over his features again. "Marina speaks wisely, but know this, Serena, the postponement gives you time, but it also gives your enemies time to plan. Not everyone will be as patient as I am willing to be." He melted back into the shadows, leaving Serena with Marina and a dozen new questions burning in her mind. As they walked toward the healer's cottage on the village outskirts, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just tilted off its axis in ways she was only beginning to understand. Marina's cottage was exactly what Serena had expected. Bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, shelves lined with bottles of mysterious tinctures, and the ever-present smell of camphor mixed with honey. But tonight, the familiar space felt different, charged, as if the very air was holding its breath. "Sit," Marina commanded, gesturing toward a chair beside the fire, "and let me see that amulet properly." Serena hesitated before lifting the chain over her head. The metal was warm to the touch, almost alive, and as Marina took it in her weathered hands, it pulsed with that same soft light that had disrupted the ceremony. "Extraordinary," Marina murmured, turning the amulet over to examine the intricate symbols carved into its surface. "I haven't seen one of these active in my lifetime. The metal is ancient silver, forged when the first bonds between mortal and immortal were made. The symbols, they respond only to true promises and genuine emotion." "What does that mean?" Serena asked. "It means, child, that your rejection tonight was not rebellion. It was honesty. The amulet recognized that your heart was not ready to make a promise it might later regret." Marina handed the chain back, and Serena felt a subtle warmth as it settled against her chest again. But it also means that when you do choose to bond with someone, that choice will be unbreakable, absolute. The old magic will see to that. Serena's hands shook as she fastened the chain. "And if I never want to bond with anyone?" Marina smiled sadly. "That amulet belonged to your bloodline, Serena. The stellar line were the peacemakers, the bridge between worlds. They were called to serve both mortal and immortal communities. That calling is in your blood now, awakened by the ceremony. You cannot run from what you are. But I can choose how to honor it," Serena said, lifting her chin with determination. "Yes," Marina agreed, "you can. But know that others will try to make that choice for you. The Harvest Festival is in 3 days, where ribbons are blessed and new agreements made. If you do not make your intentions clear by then, the Council may decide you've forfeited your right to choose at all." As if summoned by their conversation, a soft knock sounded at the cottage door. Marina rose to answer it, and Cassius stepped inside, his arms full of ancient books and scrolls. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said breathlessly, "but I've made a discovery that changes everything. These books, I found them tonight, hidden behind loose stones in the council tower. They're fragments of the original blood registries, including records of the stellar line." He spread the materials across Marina's table, and Serena found herself drawn to the faded pages covered in elegant script. The writing was in the old tongue, but somehow, looking at it, she could almost understand the meaning. "Here," Cassius pointed to a passage near the bottom of one page. "It describes the last known stellar heir, a woman named Elena who disappeared during the Great Persecution, when fear of the old bloodlines led to burnings and exile. She was said to have hidden artifacts and knowledge before vanishing. If Serena is her descendant, then I'm what?" Serena asked. "Some kind of lost princess." "Your hope," said a new voice from the doorway. They all turned to see Evangeline standing there, no longer the smooth socialite from the ceremony. Her perfectly arranged hair was windblown, her expensive dress wrinkled, and her eyes held an intensity that made Serena's skin prickle with warning. "Hope for what?" Marina asked warily. "Hope that the old ways might return," Evangeline said, stepping into the cottage without invitation. "Hope that blood will matter more than politics. Hope that some of us who have waited so long for our proper place might finally claim it." The way she said it made Serena's stomach twist. This wasn't about ancient bloodlines or lost heritage. This was about power, plain and simple, and somehow Serena had become a pawn in a game she didn't understand. "Lady Evangeline," Marina said carefully, "perhaps this discussion would be better saved for tomorrow. The child needs rest." The child, Evangeline said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, needs to understand exactly what her bloodline means for all of us. Because if she truly is stellar, then the old laws give her certain privileges, including the right to challenge existing bonds and claim higher position within the immortal hierarchy. Serena felt the amulet grow warm against her skin. I don't want to challenge anything. I just want to be left alone to live my life. That, Evangeline said softly, is unfortunately no longer an option. You see, dear, by rights of blood and the amulet's acknowledgement, you could claim a position above even our dear Darius. The stellar line ruled before the current council structure existed. If you wanted to, you could reshape our entire society. And if I don't want to, Evangeline's smile widened, then you'll need a very powerful protector to keep you safe from those who might use your bloodline for their own ends. Fortunately, I have a proposal. The cottage fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Serena looked around at the faces surrounding her. Marina's worry, Cassius's excitement, Evangeline's predatory satisfaction. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of the night market winding down. Normal people living their normal lives while her world fractured around her. What kind of proposal? She heard herself ask, though every instinct screamed at her to run. But as Evangeline began to speak, outlining plans and alliances that would bind Serena to a future she'd never chosen, one thought echoed in her mind like a warning bell. The Harvest Festival was only 3 days away, and after tonight, she was no longer just Serena the village girl who helped sick children and argued with merchants. She was Serena of the stellar bloodline, heir to power she'd never wanted and responsibilities she'd never asked for. And somewhere in the darkness beyond Marina's cottage, forces were already moving to claim her or destroy her before she could decide what that meant. Evangeline's proposal hung in the air like poison, sweet and deadly. She wanted Serena to publicly align herself with the noble houses, to use her newfound bloodline status to legitimize a political marriage that would elevate Evangeline's own standing. In exchange, she promised protection from those who might seek to exploit or eliminate the last stellar heir. It was a devil's bargain wrapped in silk and perfume, and Serena's every instinct screamed against it. I need time to think, Serena said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Of course, Evangeline purred. But remember, dear, time is a luxury that runs short when you possess something others desperately want. I'll expect your answer before the Harvest Festival begins. After Evangeline swept out into the night, Marina immediately began brewing a tea that smelled of chamomile and something sharper. Drink this, she ordered. It will help you sleep without dreams. After tonight, you'll need whatever rest you can get. But sleep, even dreamless sleep, proved elusive. Serena lay in Marina's spare bed, staring at the ceiling, while her mind raced through everything that had changed in a single evening. The amulet against her skin pulsed gently, like a second heartbeat, and every time she began to drift off, she felt as though invisible eyes were watching her through the darkness. When dawn finally broke over the village, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Serena rose, feeling more exhausted than when she'd gone to bed. Marina was already up, grinding herbs with practiced efficiency, but her movements were tight with worry. The council has declared you under protective custody until the Harvest Festival, Marina said without preamble. You're not to leave the village square area without an escort. Officially, it's for your safety. Unofficially, it's to keep me from running, Serena finished. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. So much for having time to think. There are ways around official declarations, said a familiar voice from the cottage doorway. Adrian stood there with a loaf of fresh bread and an expression that mixed determination with barely controlled anger. If you're willing to trust me, Marina frowned. Adrian, the council's decree says she needs an escort, he interrupted. It doesn't specify who that escort has to be. As a registered village musician with performance privileges, I can take her to the market, the plaza, even the old chapel if she wants to pray for guidance. Serena felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. In a world where everyone seemed to want something from her, Adrian was offering something to her instead. "You do that?" "I do a lot more than that," he said quietly, and the way he looked at her made her chest tighten with emotions she wasn't ready to examine. "We grew up together, Serena. Before all this supernatural politics and bloodline nonsense. You're still the girl who taught me to whistle bird songs and shared her lunch when my family couldn't afford proper meals. That doesn't change because some ancient jewelry decided to glow." An hour later, they walked through the village together, Adrian's musician credentials satisfying the council guards who'd been posted at strategic locations. The morning market was different from the nighttime version. Brighter, busier, filled with the chatter of early shoppers and the calls of vendors hawking fresh produce. But even here, Serena could feel the weight of curious stares and hushed conversations that died when she passed. "They're all talking about last night," she murmured. "Let them talk," Adrian said. "Most of them have never seen anything more exciting than a disputed property line, a mysterious bloodline, and a rejected bonding ceremony. They'll be gossiping about this for months." They paused at a fruit vendor's stall, where the elderly woman selling apples and pears smiled warmly at them both. "Adrian, dear boy, will you be playing at the Harvest Festival? My granddaughter loves that song you wrote about the dancing fireflies." "I wouldn't miss it, Mrs. Chen," Adrian replied, but Serena caught the way his jaw tightened. The Harvest Festival, where her future would be decided whether she wanted it to be or not. As they continued through the market, Adrian began to hum under his breath, a melody Serena didn't recognize. It was haunting and beautiful, with an underlying complexity that spoke of deeper meanings. Without thinking, she found herself humming along, and the moment their voices joined, the amulet beneath her dress grew warm. "What was that song?" she asked when the melody ended. Adrian's cheeks colored slightly. "Something I've been working on. It's about choices that come too late and loves that wait in silence." Before Serena could respond to the painful honesty in his voice, a commotion erupted near the fountain at the market center. A crowd had gathered around two figures arguing loudly. Cassius and a man Serena didn't recognize, someone whose expensive clothes and imperious bearing marked him as nobility. "The archives are not your personal research project, scholar," the stranger was saying, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Lord Darius has requested that all materials related to the stellar bloodline be secured pending official review." "Those books have been lost for decades," Cassius protested. "Their contents could revolutionize our understanding of immortal history. You can't simply lock them away again. I can do whatever I deem necessary for the stability of our community," the man replied coldly, "especially when that research involves an individual who has already demonstrated her unwillingness to respect established traditions." Serena felt heat rise in her cheeks. They were talking about her as if she weren't standing 20 feet away, as if her presence in the market wasn't already drawing attention from every direction. "Councillor Marcus," Adrian said quietly, "Darius's second in command. If he's here personally collecting research materials, it means the council is more worried about your bloodline revelation than they're letting on." Marcus's gaze swept the crowd and landed on Serena with uncomfortable intensity. He was younger than she'd expected for someone in such a high position, perhaps only a few years older than Darius himself, with sharp features and pale eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail they encountered. "Miss Serena," he said, approaching them with measured steps. "How fortunate to encounter you here. Lord Darius has requested a private audience at your convenience." It wasn't a request, despite the polite phrasing. Serena felt Adrian tense beside her, and she placed a subtle hand on his arm to keep him from saying something that might make things worse. "When?" she asked. "Now would be ideal," Marcus replied smoothly. There are matters of security that require immediate attention. The walk to the council chambers felt like a funeral march. Adrian was forced to remain behind, his musician credentials not extending to the inner sanctums of immortal governance. And Serena found herself alone with Marcus and two silent guards whose presence felt more like a threat than protection. The council building was ancient, its stone walls carved with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. The corridors echoed with their footsteps, and the air grew colder with each step deeper into the structure. When they finally reached Darius's private study, Marcus ushered her inside and closed the door with a finality that made her skin crawl. Darius stood behind a massive oak desk covered with maps, documents, and several of the books Cassius had discovered the night before. He looked up as she entered, and Serena was struck again by the intensity of his presence. In daylight, filtered through tall windows, his supernatural nature was more apparent. The too perfect symmetry of his features, the stillness that wasn't quite human, the way shadows seemed to gather around him without any natural source. "Serena," he said, and her name in his voice sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. "Thank you for coming. Did I have a choice?" "There's always a choice," he replied, moving around the desk to face her directly. "But some choices carry consequences that extend far beyond the person making them." He gestured to the books spread across his desk. "Cassius's discovery last night revealed more than just your bloodline heritage. These records document a period of immortal history that many would prefer to keep buried. Political alliances that were broken, promises that were betrayed, and power structures that were violently overthrown." Serena moved closer to examine the open pages. The text was in the old language, but as she looked at it, meaning began to emerge like images developing in a photographer's solution. She could read about treaties signed in blood, about mortal communities that had been protected or abandoned based on political expediency, about stellar line members who had tried to reform the system and paid for it with their lives. "Elena," she whispered, pointing to a name that appeared repeatedly in the margins. "The last stellar heir that Cassius mentioned. Your ancestor," Darius confirmed. "She was remarkable. Brilliant, passionate, determined to create a more equitable relationship between mortals and immortals. She almost succeeded. What happened to her?" Darius was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that spoke of personal knowledge. "She fell in love with someone who couldn't protect her from the political forces arrayed against her reforms. When the old guard moved to eliminate her, she disappeared rather than fight a war that would have destroyed everything she'd worked to build." "You knew her," Serena said. It wasn't a question. "I was young then, barely a century old. Elena was..." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "She was extraordinary. And her loss changed the course of our history in ways we're still discovering." Serena felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, which was ridiculous given that Eleanor had lived and died long before Serena was born. But the way Darius spoke about her ancestor, the reverence and regret in his voice, made it clear that Eleanor had been more than just a political ally. "Is that why you called me forward for bonding?" she asked. "Because I remind you of her?" "No," Darius said firmly. "I called you forward because you're you, Serena. Not because of your bloodline or your resemblance to someone from my past, but because of who you've chosen to be, despite having every reason to choose differently." "And who is that exactly?" "Someone who gives her own food to hungry children. Someone who argues with merchants on behalf of people who can't afford medicine. Someone who stands up to supernatural beings twice her size when they're being unfair to her neighbors." His voice softened. "Someone who values consent enough to reject a bond ceremony in front of the entire community, even knowing the consequences that rejection might bring." Heat rose in Serena's cheeks, and she looked away from the intensity in his eyes. "Those consequences are becoming clearer by the hour. Evangeline made me an offer last night." Darius went very still. What kind of offer? Political alliance. Public support for her own ambitions in exchange for protection from those who might want to use or eliminate me. Serena met his gaze again. She seemed to think my bloodline gives me the right to challenge your authority. It does, Darius said quietly. The stellar line predates the current council structure by several centuries. If you chose to claim your heritage, you could theoretically demand leadership of the entire immortal community. But I don't want that. Which is exactly why you'd be good at it, he replied with a slight smile. Power corrupts most easily when it's desperately sought. Someone who doesn't want authority is often the safest person to wield it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus entered without waiting for permission, his expression tight with urgency. My lord, we have a situation. The village chapel has been vandalized. Someone broke in during the night and destroyed several historical artifacts, including the old blessing basin that dates back to the founding of the settlement. Darius's expression darkened, any indication of who was responsible. The damage pattern suggests supernatural strength, but the perpetrator was careful to avoid leaving clear traces. However, there was this. Marcus held up a torn piece of midnight blue fabric, found caught on the chapel door. Serena's blood turned to ice. She recognized that fabric, the same color and texture as the gown Evangeline had worn the night before. Either Lady Evangeline had been involved in the vandalism, or someone wanted it to appear that way. There's more, Marcus continued. Several villagers reported seeing figures moving through the cemetery behind the chapel around midnight. And the old bell tower, the one that's been silent for decades, rang 3 times just before dawn. The warning bells, Darius murmured. But warnings of what? Before anyone could answer, another knock echoed through the study. This time, it was a young page, breathless from running. My lord, the boy gasped. Marina the healer requests your immediate presence. She says it's about Miss Serena's amulet. She says it started singing. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Serena's heart hammering against her ribs. As if summoned by the page's words, the amulet beneath her dress began to pulse with warmth, and she could swear she heard the faintest whisper of melody, too soft to make out, but undeniably there. Singing, Darius repeated slowly. Elena's amulet never sang. Not once in all the years she wore it. Then what does it mean? Serena asked, though part of her was afraid of the answer. It means, Marcus said grimly, that whatever's been sleeping in our community for the past 3 centuries has finally begun to wake up, and it's responding to you. As they hurried through the village toward Marina's cottage, Serena couldn't shake the feeling that forces beyond her understanding were moving like chess pieces across a board she couldn't see. The harvest festival was still 2 days away, but already the careful balance of their community was beginning to fracture. The vandalized chapel, the mysterious figures in the cemetery, the ancient bell ringing after decades of silence, it all felt like the opening moves of a game whose rules she didn't understand. And at the center of it all was her amulet, pulsing against her skin like a heartbeat, singing a song that might be calling something home or warning it away. Either way, Serena had the sinking feeling that her attempt to buy time by rejecting the bonding ceremony had actually accelerated whatever was coming. The only question now was whether she would be strong enough to face it when it finally arrived, and whether the people she was beginning to care about would survive the aftermath of her choices. Because as they reached Marina's cottage and heard the unmistakable sound of the amulet's ethereal song growing stronger, one thing became terrifyingly clear. There would be no more hiding from her heritage, no more pretending to be just another village girl. The stellar bloodline had awakened, and with it, powers and responsibilities that would reshape not just her life, but the fate of everyone she'd come to love. The amulet's song was unlike anything Serena had ever heard, haunting and beautiful, like voices calling across centuries. As they entered Marina's cottage, the melody grew stronger. and Serena could see the healer's face pale with recognition. "I've heard that song before," Marina whispered, her hands trembling as she reached for an ancient journal buried deep in her herb cabinet. "Decades ago, when I was just a young apprentice. My mentor described it as the Song of Awakening, but I never believed it was real." She opened the journal to a page covered with faded ink and careful illustrations. There, drawn in meticulous detail, was Serena's amulet, but with additional symbols glowing around its edges. "The song means the barrier is thinning," Marina explained. "The magical boundary that Elena created before she disappeared. It's been protecting this village from forces that would seek to exploit or destroy anyone with stellar blood. But barriers need anchors, and if the anchor is awakening, the anchor is me," Serena said, the knowledge settling into her bones like cold truth. Darius stepped closer, his expression grave. "If the barrier falls, every supernatural entity with a grudge against the stellar line will be able to find you. Elena's enemies are still alive, Serena. Immortals have long memories and longer lifespans." The cottage door burst open without warning, and Adrian stumbled inside, his face flushed with panic. "Serena, thank the gods you're safe. The village. Something's happening. People are seeing things, hearing voices, and the harvest decorations." He paused, catching his breath. "They're moving by themselves." Through the cottage windows, they could see the village square in the distance, where ribbons and garlands that had been hung for tomorrow's festival swayed despite the absence of any wind. Worse, the colored fabric seemed to be arranging itself into patterns, symbols that hurt to look at directly. "The festival," Marcus said grimly. "Someone's corrupting the harvest ritual. If they succeed in poisoning the ceremonial bonds tomorrow night, every mortal-immortal alliance in the region could be severed," Darius finished. 3 centuries of peaceful coexistence destroyed in a single evening. Serena felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on her shoulders. Her rejection of the bonding ceremony, her heritage, her very existence, all of it was threatening the lives of innocent people who'd only ever shown her kindness. "There has to be something I can do," she said desperately. Marina exchanged a meaningful look with Darius. "There is, but the cost? Tell me." "Elena's journal," Marina said slowly, "describes a ritual of binding, not between 2 people, but between a stellar heir and the land itself. It would strengthen the protective barrier permanently, but the person performing it would be forever tied to this place. They could never leave, never have a normal life. And," Darius added quietly, "the ritual requires a voluntary bonding with someone whose supernatural essence is strong enough to anchor the magic. Someone like an immortal leader." The cottage fell silent. Serena understood what they weren't saying. She could save everyone, but only by accepting the very bond she'd rejected 2 nights ago. The irony was bitter as poison. "So my choices are to let everyone suffer for my selfish desire for freedom, or sacrifice my future to fix a problem I created," she said. "This isn't your fault," Adrian said fiercely. "You didn't ask for any of this. You don't owe anyone your entire life just because you were born with the wrong bloodline. But if I don't act, people will die," Serena replied. "Children like little Clara, who depend on the medicine trade between mortal and immortal healers. Families who've built their livelihoods on the cooperation between our communities." She looked at Darius, seeing her own anguish reflected in his dark eyes. "If I agreed to the bonding ritual, would you respect my choices afterward? Would you let me have some control over my own life?" "Serena," he said softly, "if you bound yourself to me to save others, I would spend eternity trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. Your happiness would become my primary concern, above my own needs, above council politics, above everything." The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the cottage like a blade. "How touching," Evangeline said from the doorway, no longer bothering to hide the malice beneath her perfect features. The great sacrifice, the noble choice. Except you're all missing a crucial detail. She stepped inside, flanked by two figures Serena didn't recognize, immortals whose presence made the air in the cottage feel thick and oppressive. The barrier isn't failing because of Serena's awakening, Evangeline continued. It's failing because I've been systematically destroying Elena's anchor points for months. The chapel artifacts, the cemetery stones, the old blessing wells, all carefully demolished to weaken the magical foundations. Marina gasped. You've been planning this since before the ceremony. Of course I have, Evangeline laughed. Did you really think Serena's emergence was coincidence? I've been tracking stellar bloodline descendants for decades, waiting for one strong enough to serve my purposes. The bonding ceremony was meant to force her awakening, and her rejection simply accelerated my timeline. What do you want? Darius demanded, his voice carrying the dangerous edge that reminded everyone why he led the immortal community. What I've always wanted, Evangeline said, to restore the old order, mortals serving immortals as it should be. The stellar line wasn't meant to create equality between species. Elena perverted their original purpose. The first stellar rulers were conquerors who used mortal populations as resources. I intend to return us to that proper hierarchy. Over my dead body, Serena said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. That can certainly be arranged, one of Evangeline's companions hissed, bearing fangs that gleamed in the cottage's firelight. Actually, Evangeline said thoughtfully, killing her would be wasteful. A bound stellar heir under my control would be far more useful. There are ways to ensure loyalty after all. Blood magic has such interesting applications. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Serena felt the amulet against her chest growing hot, and suddenly the song it had been emitting changed, becoming deeper, more urgent. Without thinking, she reached for the chain and lifted it over her head. The moment the amulet touched her palm, the cottage filled with brilliant silver light. The symbols carved into the metal blazed like stars, and Serena felt power flow through her like liquid fire. She could sense the village around them, every life, both mortal and immortal, every thread of connection that bound the community together. And she could feel the darkness that Evangeline had been weaving through those connections, poison spreading through the magical foundations of their world. Impossible, Evangeline breathed. You're not trained. You don't know the proper forms. I don't need training, Serena said, her voice echoing with harmonics that seemed to come from the amulet itself. I am stellar. This is what we were born to do. She closed her eyes and reached out with senses she hadn't known she possessed. She could feel Marina's cottage, its walls strong with decades of healing energy. She could sense Darius beside her, his supernatural essence like a pillar of dark flame. Adrian's mortal life force burned bright and warm, anchored by his music and his love for her. And beyond them, the village spread out like a living map, each soul a point of light in her awareness. But threaded through it all were Evangeline's corruptions, dark tendrils that sought to twist loyalty into servitude, cooperation into domination. Serena reached for them with her newfound power and began to unravel the damage, one poisoned connection at a time. "Stop her!" Evangeline screamed at her companions. They lunged forward, but Darius moved faster than human eyes could follow, intercepting one while Adrian surprised everyone by smashing the other over the head with Marina's heaviest mortar. The immortal staggered but didn't fall, turning on Adrian with murderous intent. "Adrian, no!" Serena cried, her concentration shattering as she saw fangs heading for the throat of the boy who'd shared his lunch with her as children. The amulet's power surged chaotically, and suddenly the cottage was full of Elena's voice, speaking across the centuries with urgent clarity. The ritual requires willing sacrifice, but not the sacrifice of freedom. Let the bond be between equals. Let the choice be made in love, and let the magic serve all who call this place home. Understanding crashed over Serena like a wave. Elena hadn't created the protective barrier by binding herself to the land. She'd created it by choosing to trust someone else with her heart, completely and without reservation. The magic hadn't come from sacrifice, but from the courage to be vulnerable with someone worthy of that trust. "Darius!" Serena called, still holding the blazing amulet. "The bonding ritual, if I choose it freely, if we choose it together, will you help me rebuild the barrier the right way?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, even as he grappled with Evangeline's remaining companion. "Whatever you need, Serena, always." She looked at Adrian, whose face showed heartbreak and understanding in equal measure. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said, stepping back from the fallen immortal with Marina's help. "I love you enough to want you to be happy, even if that happiness isn't with me. Besides," he added with a shaky smile, "someone needs to write songs about the legend of Serena Stella. Might as well be someone who knew her when she was just a girl who whistled bird songs." Evangeline made one last desperate lunge towards Serena, but the silver light of the amulet flared, and the corrupted immortal bounced off it as if she'd hit a wall. "Now," Serena said, extending her free hand toward Darius, "before she recovers." His fingers closed around hers, and the moment their skin touched, the amulet's song exploded into a symphony that shook the cottage walls. Silver light poured from the metal and spread out through the village like ripples on water, touching every building, every tree, every soul within the boundaries of their community. But this time, instead of creating barriers that separated mortal from immortal, the magic wove connections that strengthened both. Serena could feel it happening. The baker's bread would rise higher because the immortal healer down the street had blessed the yeast. The musicians' songs would carry supernatural harmonies that could mend broken hearts. The children would grow up knowing that differences in species mattered less than kindness and courage. When the light finally faded, Evangeline and her companions were gone, fled back to whatever dark corners they'd emerged from. The cottage was quiet, except for the sound of breathing and the gentle ticking of Marina's herb-drying clock. "Is it over?" Adrian asked. "This part is," Serena said, still holding Darius's hand. The amulet had cooled against her palm, but she could feel its contentment, like a cat purring after a satisfying meal. "But I think it's also just the beginning." Outside, the first bells of the harvest festival began to ring, calling the community together for a celebration that would be unlike any in their history. As they walked toward the village square, Serena reflected on how much had changed in just 3 days. She was no longer just a girl who helped sick children and argued with unfair merchants. She was Serena of the Stella bloodline, bound by choice and love to both a man who would spend eternity proving himself worthy of her sacrifice and a community that would thrive because she'd been brave enough to trust. The harvest festival unfolded around them like a living tapestry. Ribbons danced in patterns that now blessed instead of corrupted. Children laughed as they chased fireflies that sparkled with just a touch of magic, and mortals and immortals shared food and stories without the undercurrent of tension that had shadowed such gatherings for months. Adrian played his guitar by the fountain, his music carrying new harmonies that spoke of bittersweet endings and hopeful beginnings. When he caught Serena's eye across the crowd, he smiled and nodded toward Darius, then launched into a song about loves that choose courage over comfort. "He'll be all right," Marina said, appearing at Serena's elbow with a cup of festival wine. "Musicians have a way of turning heartbreak into beauty, and I suspect he'll find his own happiness soon enough. There's a young woman in the next village who's been asking about him. You know about her. Healers know everything, dear. It's our job." Marina clinked her cup against Serena's, to choices made in love instead of fear. As the evening wore on and the festival reached its peak, Darius drew Serena away from the crowd to a quiet corner of the square where ancient stones formed a natural alcove. "Regrets?" he asked quietly. "About choosing you?" "Never." She leaned against his chest, feeling the steady coolness of his supernatural form and finding it comforting rather than alien. About the life I'll never have? Sometimes, but then I think about the life I will have and the regrets fade. What kind of life do you see for us? Serena considered the question, watching the festival swirl around them. I see us learning to balance your leadership with my stubborn independence. I see quiet mornings when you teach me about immortal history and loud evenings when I drag you to community meetings to argue about fair trade policies. I see us making mistakes and figuring out how to apologize properly. That sounds wonderfully ordinary, Darius said with a smile in his voice. The best kind of extraordinary usually is, Serena replied. When the festival bells rang midnight, marking the official end of the harvest celebration, most of the villagers began to drift toward their homes. But Serena and Darius remained in their stone alcove, talking in low voices about the future they would build together, not just as supernatural mates, but as partners in the ongoing work of maintaining balance between worlds. The amulet rested quietly against Serena's chest, its ancient power content now that its purpose had been fulfilled. She was no longer the untamable girl who had rejected a bond ceremony in front of the entire community. She was something far more dangerous and far more precious, a woman who had chosen her own path and found love waiting for her at the end of it. And in the months and years that followed, the village would thrive in ways that surprised everyone. Children would grow up bilingual in mortal and immortal languages, young couples would court across species lines without fear, and the music that filled the air would carry harmonies that spoke of a community that had learned to transform differences into strengths. But that night, as the harvest moon set behind the mountains and the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, Serena was content to simply sit in Darius's arms and listen to the gentle sounds of a village at peace. She had found her place in the world, not as a reluctant heir to ancient power, but as a bridge between worlds, a keeper of balance, and a woman brave enough to trust her heart even when the future was uncertain. The song of the stellar bloodline had been sung, and its melody would echo through generations yet to come.